Frank Gaffney says we ought to be taking our time and attention over to China. Frank, welcome back to the program. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, Lars. Thank you very much for having me back.
You bet. Frank Gaffney is the president of the Center for Security Policy, and you also have a new title.
Well, I do. I'm the vice chairman of a new group we call the Committee on the Present Danger China. And some of your listeners may, like me, have been imprinted when we were young by a group of a similar name, the Committee on the Present Danger, that helped Ronald Reagan. First when he was running for president in 1980, and then after he became president, to define for the public and for, the body politic specifically, an awareness of how grave the danger was of the Soviet Union. And frankly, Lars, bad as it was in its heyday, it pales by comparison to what we're dealing with now in communist China. And this group has come together for the purpose of doing something similar. We hope to support President Trump, who has been pretty clear-eyed about the dangers that China represents. He's focused like a laser at the moment, and properly so, I think, on trying to fix something that is particularly egregious, namely the trade practices of China and the structure that makes them predators that have ripped off our jobs and ripped off our manufacturing base and have, among other things, ripped off a lot of our technology. But it's so much more than that. And what we did yesterday, Lars, and I would commend to your listeners a terrific video of this 2 hours of presentations. Most of them are 4 minutes long, so if you've got short attention spans, you can take it aboard at your leisure. But it's available at presentdangerchina.org. And just check it out, folks, because we had about 21 speakers talking about the various ways in which the Chinese threat is not only present, but is existential. And I can go through some of the examples if you'd like, but that's the bottom line.
Well,
an existential threat to our country.
This is the concern, that a lot of us have. You're more studied on China than I am, but just from a distance, you have a country that has all of the armament, or at least a sufficient amount of armament to be as big a danger to the United States, and they are also an economic power in a way that the old Soviet Union never was, but China is. And they've begun to expand their reach. Russia, when it was the Soviet Union, did it through reaching out and grabbing little, their satellite states and then turning them into part of the Soviet Union. China's doing it by literally building land, building islands to take over part of the South China Sea. And so we've got a country that on all fronts appears to be saying we are going to become much bigger and much more powerful, and you won't question us. You won't even cross us. And unfortunately, Frank, I want to ask you about this. Our country seems to have kowtowed to the Chinese a lot over the last few decades. We've kowtowed to them on Taiwan. We can't get their full cooperation when it comes to North Korea, and it might be very helpful. They clearly do not want us helped, and they are an economic and military adversary, and I hope Americans wake up to that.
Well, our purpose is to make sure that that happens, Lars. You're absolutely right. The only thing I would say is that's only the half of it, or maybe even an 18th of it. The truth is, what they're doing in the South China Sea, which is some of the most strategic waters in the world, because an immense amount of trade flows through there, including a lot of energy to allied nations who are friends of ours. But, Lars, they're doing it in other choke points around the world, on the Horn of Africa, in Pakistan, the access to the Arabian Sea, in the Panama Canal, elsewhere in the Caribbean. There's reason to believe that they're going to go for the Azores next, which would give them an ability to intercept traffic along the North Atlantic. I mean, this is, again, part of a concerted, disciplined, systematic, and very dangerous program that has in the unmistakable, trajectory of it, displacing the United States as the basically benign, dominant power in the world, and having that role now played by one that is anything but benign. Not benign to us, not benign to freedom-loving people elsewhere in the free world, not benign even to people in the developing world who don't have freedom, and they're not going to have a lot of other things either because the Chinese are ripping them off as part of what they call the Belt and Road Initiative. Anyway, we went through this in very considerable detail, even though it was in 4-minute increments. And I really commend it to your listeners because it's the beginning, we hope, of a concerted effort to make sure we are aware of this danger and then begin taking steps to counteract it.
Well, and in fact, Frank, do you have any initial suggestions? You worked for President Reagan. What should we do to begin to counter it? I mean, economically, I think part of what Donald Trump is doing on trade deals is part of that counter. We no longer let China use us as a way of financing their both economic expansion and their military expansion. But beyond that, what else do we do to keep the Chinese from being, either politically or not politically, economically or militarily dominant on the planet?
It's a great question, Lars, and I think you're right to cite Ronald Reagan because I had a small role in helping him execute the strategy that came out of the earlier Committee on the Present Danger, which was an all instruments of national policy strategy used to try to do everything from deny the Soviet Union then the kind of military advantage that it had and that it was building, to try to ensure that it didn't have access to Western markets, that it didn't have access to technologies that would go into their military and other things of an economic warfare character. But perhaps as important as anything, Lars, and you may remember this, was the President of the United States went directly at the legitimacy of that Soviet regime. He called it an evil empire. Remember?
Yeah, I do.
He talked about putting it on the dustbin of history. The Chinese Communist Party is every bit as evil, and I would argue far more dangerous than was its Soviet counterpart, and a challenge to its legitimacy, both with the Chinese people themselves, who I think are becoming increasingly restive, and with people elsewhere around the world who are being told, oh, if you just make a deal with us, we'll build you an airport, we'll build you a railroad, we'll build you a port. Only it turns out, what they call payday loans, right?
Yep.
It turns out that you can't afford it and the Chinese are going to expropriate it.
Well, imagine this, Frank. They invited Boeing. You want to sell us planes? You start building some of your planes here. What does China now have? They have an airplane manufacturing ability, and they've got the economic muscle to probably outmuscle what Boeing is going to be able to do. So we take America's single largest export, Boeing airplanes, and we hand the business to the Chinese, not in the short run, but in the long run. Frank, thank you very much. Frank Gaffney from the Center for Security Policy. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show.